The signal arrived at the human relay station 41 hours after the world had already gone silent, and by the time it reached the ears of anyone who could act, the thing it described was already over. That was the first cruelty of distance in the deep black between stars. Grief always arrived late, wearing the clothes of news, pretending to be something that could still be changed. The station was called Meridian Watch, and it hung in the empty margin of a system that human charts had labeled only with a number. It was not a fortress. It was not even, properly speaking, a military installation. It was a listening post, a lonely ring of habitat modules and antenna arrays strung together at the edge of a young frontier, staffed by a rotating crew of 43 people whose job was mostly to record, to catalog, and to pass along whatever the void whispered to them. Most of what the void whispered was noise, radiation from dying stars, the slow tidal groan of gas giants, the occasional burst of some alien commerce fleet talking to itself across a shipping lane. Nothing that demanded a response. Nothing that demanded anything of the humans at all, except patience and a steady hand on the dial. Kael Aurelia had been on Meridian Watch for 11 months. She was 24 years old, which on the frontier was not young exactly, but was young enough that the older engineers still called her the kid when they wanted her to fetch something. She had a narrow face and dark hair she kept cropped short because the recyclers on the station made washing it a chore, and she had come out to the edge of human space for the same reason a certain kind of person always came to the edge of things, because she had wanted to be somewhere the noise of home could not reach her, and because she had believed, in the way that only the very earnest believe, that listening was a form of service. That if you paid close enough attention to the universe, you might catch the moment it needed you. She was on shift alone in the signals bay when the message came. It did not announce itself. There were no alarms, no red lights, none of the theatrics that stories give to the moment the world changes. There was only a shift in the pattern on her screen, a structured burst rising out of the background hiss, and the small animal part of her brain that had spent 11 months learning the difference between noise and meaning going suddenly, coldly alert. She leaned forward. She adjusted the gain. She isolated the burst and fed it to the decoders, and she watched the machines chew through layers of alien encoding that had clearly not been meant to keep humans out, because the people who had sent it had not been thinking about humans at all. They had been thinking about being heard by anyone. By everyone. By whatever was left in the sky that might still have a conscience. The signal came from a world called Senat. Kael had heard of it, the way one hears of a distant town in a country one has never visited. Senat was a garden world in the territory of the Thren, a people who had held their small cluster of stars for longer than humans had held fire. The Thren were not a spacefaring power in the grand sense. They had ships, but they did not conquer with them. They traded, they farmed light and water and patience, and they had the misfortune of sitting at the wrong edge of a much larger empire. That empire had a name that translated, roughly, into human tongues as the concordat of the ascendant throne, and at its center sat a figure the galaxy called, without irony and without love, the Emperor. The Emperor's name was Varsk Olith, and until that night Kael had thought of him the way one thinks of weather in a country one will never live in. A fact, a pressure system, something that happened to other people. The signal from Senat changed that. It was a plea. That much was clear before the translators had finished their work. The shape of it, the rising desperation of its repetition, the way it looped back on itself as if the sender could not bear to stop transmitting for fear that stopping would mean the end. When the words resolved into human language, they came in the flat, careful phrasing of the translation matrix, and that flatness made them worse, because the machine did not know how to be gentle, and so it simply told her, in plain declarative sentences, what had happened on Senat. Kael read it once. Then she read it again, because the first time her mind had refused to hold it, had slid off the surface of the words the way a hand slides off ice. The second time she made herself hold it. She sat very still in the cold blue light of the signal's bay, 41 hours and an unbridgeable gulf of distance away from a world she had never seen, and she held the knowledge of what had been done there until it stopped being information and became grief. She would not, afterward, be able to say exactly how long she sat there. The station's log recorded 11 minutes between the completion of the decode and the moment she keyed the general alarm. In her memory, it was both a heartbeat and an age. The thing the Emperor had done on Senat did not need to be described in full for its weight to land, and Kael would spend the rest of her life refusing to describe it in full, because she came to understand that some acts are diminished by detail, that to catalog an atrocity is to risk turning it into a story with a shape, and this had no shape. It had only a fact at its center, and the fact was this. The Thren of Senat had refused a demand from the throne, a demand for tribute and for compliance and for the surrender of their independence, and the Emperor, to make an example that no other world in his reach would ever forget, had answered their refusal not by killing the soldiers who had no army, and not by killing the leaders who had made the choice, but by turning his weapons on the youngest and the most defenseless, on the schools, on the creches, on the great communal gardens where the Thren raised their children in the open air, because for 10,000 years no one had ever thought a child could be a target. Thousands of them. The signal said thousands, and the flat machine voice of the translator gave the number and then gave it again, as if the sender had needed to repeat it to make it real, and Kael understood that she was reading the words of someone standing in the aftermath of it, someone who had survived only long enough to make sure that somebody, and somewhere, would know. That was the whole of the plea. Not a request for rescue. The sender knew rescue was impossible, knew the distances, knew the deadness of the sky. Just a request to be witnessed. Please, the signal said in its looping, desperate way. Please let someone know this happened. Please do not let it be as though it never was. Please do not let him do this and have the silence swallow it. And then at a certain point in the recording the signal simply stopped. Not faded, stopped. The way a voice stops. Kael keyed the alarm. The crew of Meridian Watch came to the signal's bay in ones and twos, in sleep clothes and half-fastened jackets, grumbling and then not grumbling, because there is a quality to a certain kind of summons that silences complaint before a word of it is spoken. They filled the small room, 42 of them plus Kael, and she played them the signal, and she watched their faces change the way hers had changed, watched the grumbling drain out of them and something older and heavier flow in to take its place. When it was done, nobody spoke for a long time. The station commander was a woman named Ilse Devanter, 60 years old, with the weathered calm of someone who had spent a career at the edges of things, and had learned that the edges did not care about your feelings. She stood at the front of the room with her arms folded, and she looked at the frozen waveform on the screen, the visual shape of a dead world's last words, and when she finally spoke her voice was very quiet. We log it, she said. We verify it. We pass it up the chain to Fleet Command with our authentication. That is the protocol, and the protocol exists so that people who are grieving do not make decisions that get other people killed. Someone near the back, a young engineer named Ridley, made a sound, not quite a word. Devanter turned toward it. Say it, she said. Say it out loud so we can all look at it. Ridley swallowed. By the time it goes up the chain and back down, he said, the Emperor will already be somewhere else, doing this somewhere else, to someone else. We'll have a very well-authenticated record of a thing nobody stopped. Yes, said Devanter. She did not soften it. That is exactly what we'll have. That is what a listening post is. We are the memory of the frontier, not its fist. We do not have a fist. We have 43 people, one aging patrol cutter that isn't rated for combat, and a mandate to observe. Anyone who forgets that is going to turn a tragedy into two tragedies. She was right. Kael knew she was right, in the part of her mind that dealt in resources and ranges, and the cold arithmetic of what could actually be done. Meridian Watch could not fight an empire. Meridian Watch could barely defend itself against a determined pirate. The idea of the little station rising up in wrath against the Concordat of the Ascendant Throne was not brave. It was a fantasy, and fantasies got people killed. And yet, Kael stood at her console and looked at the frozen shape of Senat's last transmission, and she felt something moving in her that was not a plan and was not a fantasy and was not, whatever it might have looked like from outside, an act of despair. It was closer to the thing she had come to the frontier looking for, all those months ago, when she had told herself that listening was a form of service. She had wanted to be somewhere the universe might need her. She had said that to herself as a young woman's romantic notion, a thing to make the loneliness feel like purpose. And now the universe had reached out across 41 hours of dead space and asked one thing of her. Not rescue, not war, just this: do not let the silence swallow it. She realized the room had gone quiet again and that people were looking at her, because at some point she had stepped forward, out of her place at the console, into the open space at the front of the bay. She had not decided to do it. Her body had done it while her mind was still turning. Devanter's eyes were on her, steady and not unkind. Something to add, Aurelia. Kael opened her mouth. She did not yet know what she was going to say. She only knew that the flat machine voice repeating a number had lodged somewhere beneath her ribs and would not be dislodged by protocol, and that the word please had been said to her, personally, across an impossible distance, by someone who was now dead, and that she was the one who had heard it, and that hearing something was not the same as witnessing it, and that witnessing was not the same as answering. She thought of all the words she could say: report, verify, escalate, wait. All the right words, the safe words, the words that would keep 42 people alive and would let the Emperor go on being weather. And she found that she could not say any of them. What she said instead was small. It was almost nothing. It was one word, and she said it very quietly, and yet in the silence of that room it landed like a stone dropped into a still pool, and the rings of it would spread outward across the whole of human space before the year was out. But that word comes later. To understand why it mattered, why a single word from a 24-year-old signals officer on a nothing station at the edge of nowhere could become the hinge on which so much turned, you have to understand what the humans were in that age of the galaxy, and what the galaxy believed them to be. Because the galaxy did not fear humanity, not yet. The galaxy had barely noticed it. Humans had come up out of their single blue world into a crowded and ancient sky, and they had done it late, so late that all the good real estate was taken, and all the great powers were already old. The Concordat had ruled its stars for 8,000 years. The Thren had farmed Senat for 10,000. There were civilizations in the galactic core that measured their histories in the lifespans of stars, and against all that vast antiquity, the humans were an eye blink, a species that had learned to cross the dark only a few centuries before, still clustered in a handful of systems, still poor, still learning the etiquette of a universe that had never asked them to arrive. The great powers, when they thought of humans at all, thought of them as one thinks of a new tenant in a very old building, occasionally loud, prone to strange enthusiasms, not important. The Emperor Varsk Olith, who had turned his weapons on the children of Senat to make an example, had almost certainly never spoken the word human in his life. Why would he? Humans were 300 light years and several political irrelevancies away from anything he cared about. They had no fleet that could threaten him. They had no allies who would spend blood on their behalf. They were, in the ledger of galactic power, a rounding error. This was the thing the Emperor did not know, and it was the thing that most of the galaxy did not know, and it was, in the end, the thing that Kael Aurelia was about to teach them, though she did not know it yet either as she stood in the cold blue light of the signals bay with one word rising in her throat. The thing they did not know was this: that humanity's short history had not made it shallow. It had made it raw. The great old powers had had 10,000 years to grow calluses over their own atrocities, to file the sharp edges off their histories, to learn the vast institutional patience that lets an ancient civilization watch a horror unfold 3 systems over and file a report about it. Humans had none of that yet. Humans still remembered, in their bones, in their stories, in the living memory of a species that had climbed up out of its own barbarism only yesterday, exactly what it felt like when the strong turned their strength against the helpless. They had not yet learned to look away. They had not yet grown the callous. And so when the last words of a murdered world reached the ears of a young human who had come to the edge of everything specifically because she still believed that listening was a form of service, they did not slide off. They landed. They lodged. And they demanded, with a force that 8,000 years of imperial habit had forgotten was even possible, to be answered. Kael Aurelia looked at the commander, and at the crew, and at the frozen shape of a dead voice on the screen. She thought of the number, and of the gardens, and of the word please. And she spoke. "Witness," she said. That was the word, not vengeance, not war, not fire, witness. For a moment it seemed to land wrong, or not to land at all, a small word in a small voice, easily mistaken for surrender. Ridley frowned. Someone at the back exhaled, half in relief, thinking she had chosen the safe path after all. Even Devanter's expression flickered, uncertain of what she was being offered. But Kael was not finished, and the single word had not meant what they thought it meant. She let it hang in the air until the silence itself became a question, and then she gave the silence its answer. "The signal asked us to witness," she said. Her voice was steady now, steadier than she had any right to expect. Not to avenge, not to save. Someone stood in the ruin of their whole world and used the last of their power to ask one thing of the sky, and the thing they asked was, let someone know. Let it not be as though it never was. She looked around the room at faces she had eaten and slept and worked beside for 11 months. And we are the someone. We are the ones who heard. That's not an accident of routing. That's the whole of it. The universe put this in front of us, and it asked us to witness. And I think we have to decide what that word actually costs. "It costs a report," said Devanter. "That's what witnessing is, Aurelia. We saw, we record, we testify. That's the honorable thing, and it's the survivable thing. And those two do not often line up as neatly as they do right now." "With respect, Commander," Kael said, and she meant the respect, "a report is not a witness. A report is a filing. You can witness a murder and write it down and mail it to someone 3 years away and call yourself clean, and maybe you are clean, but the thing you witnessed is not served by it. To witness, really witness, is to refuse to let the thing be erased. And the Emperor is not just going to erase Senat. He already has. Senat is gone. What he's counting on now, the whole point of what he did, the entire strategy of it, is that the erasing works. That you kill the children of one world so loudly that every other world falls silent out of terror. He didn't do it in secret. He did it as a message, and the message only works if the sky stays quiet. She took a breath. "To witness him," she said, "is to make sure the sky doesn't stay quiet. That's the word. That's what I mean by it." The room had changed while she spoke. She could feel it. The way you feel a tide turn, not a sudden thing, but the slow reversal of a mass of water. She was not offering them a battle. She was offering them something more dangerous and more possible, a refusal. Devanter was quiet for a long moment. She was not a foolish woman, and she was not a cruel one, and she had not survived 40 years on the frontier by mistaking a feeling for a plan. When she spoke again, her voice had lost none of its steadiness, but something under it had shifted. "Say I grant every word of that," she said. "Say I agree that a filing is not enough and that the Emperor is counting on our silence. Tell me what witnessing looks like that is more than a report and less than throwing 43 people into a furnace. Because those are not the only 2 options, but the space between them is very narrow. And I have watched better people than you fall into the furnace convinced they were doing the narrow thing." And that was the moment Kael Aurelia stopped being a signals officer with a grief in her chest and became something else. Because she had an answer, and the answer had been assembling itself in the back of her mind the whole time she spoke, built out of 11 months of listening to the traffic of the frontier and knowing, better than anyone else on that station, exactly how information moved through the dark. He did it in the open, she said slowly, because he wanted the whole region to see, which means he transmitted. An act of terror that isn't witnessed isn't terror, it's just a crime. He needed witnesses, his own kind of witnesses, terrified ones, so he made sure the record of what he did on Senate would propagate. His fleet will have logged it. His command channels will have carried the after-action reports. Somewhere in the Concordat's own network is the Emperor's own account of what he did in his own hand, meant to frighten his subjects into obedience. She looked at Devanter. We are a listening post. Listening is the one thing we are actually good at. We can't fight his fleet. But we can hear his fleet, and if we can hear it, we can prove it, not with a plea from a dying world that his people will call a fabrication, but with his own transmissions, his own boasts. The Emperor made a confession, Commander. He made it on purpose. He just doesn't understand yet that a confession, once it leaves your mouth, belongs to whoever's listening. The silence in the signal's bay had a different quality now. It was the silence of people doing arithmetic. Devanter unfolded her arms. You want to turn a listening post into an instrument of testimony, she said. You want to gather the Emperor's own record of his own atrocity and put it in front of the galaxy in a form that cannot be denied. I want to make the silence impossible, Kael said. I don't want to kill him. I'm not sure we even could, and I'm not sure I'd know how to want it if we could. I want to take away the thing he actually did this for. He murdered a world's children to buy silence. I want to make sure the one thing he can never have again is silence. I want every world in his reach that he was trying to frighten to hear, in his own voice, exactly what he is, and to hear it alongside the fact that someone, somewhere, refused to look away. And you think that changes anything, Devanter said. It was not quite a question. I think it's the only thing that changes anything, Kael said. You can't undo Senat. Nobody can. But you can decide whether Senat was the beginning of a silence or the beginning of a reckoning. And that's not decided by fleets. It's decided by whether one witness is willing to speak before the fear sets in. It always is. That's how every reckoning in the history of my whole species started, not with an army but with one person who wouldn't be quiet. Devanter looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at the rest of the crew, at the 42 other faces in the room, and Kael understood that the commander was not weighing whether Kael was right. She had decided that sometime in the last minute. She was weighing whether she had the right to spend other people's safety on it. This is not a small thing I'm being asked to allow, Devanter said, to the room and not to Kael. Understand what it is clearly. If we do this, if we turn our arrays toward the Concordat and start pulling the Emperor's own traffic and packaging it as testimony, we stop being invisible. We stop being a nothing station that nobody bothers with. The moment the throne understands that a human listening post is gathering evidence of the Emperor's atrocity and preparing to broadcast it, we become a target, not a metaphorical target. His fleet is not far, and we cannot fight it. So I am not going to order this. I have never in my life ordered people to their deaths for a principle, and I am too old to start. If we do this, we do it because every one of you chooses it. And if even one of you says no, we do the honorable, survivable thing, and we file the report and we live with it. That's the deal. That's the only deal I'll offer. The room was very still. And then, one by one, in the small, undramatic way that ordinary people say the largest things, they chose. Ridley first, the young engineer who had spoken the hard truth earlier. He didn't make a speech, he just said, "I'm in," and looked faintly surprised at himself for it. Then a woman named Osai, who ran the reactor, who had 2 children back home in the inner systems, and said, precisely because of that, if it were mine on that world, I'd want someone to be the someone. And she nodded once, and that was her vote. Then the others, in a spreading murmur, some of them frightened, None of them cheerful, all of them clear. Not one of them said it as though it were brave. They said it as though it were simply the thing in front of them, the way you'd say you'd help carry something heavy that had fallen on a stranger, because you were there and your hands worked and it needed carrying. Kael watched them choose, and something in her chest that had been clenched since the signal came loosened, not into relief. There was no relief in this. There would be no relief for a long time, but into a kind of terrible steadiness. She had said one word, and the word had not been a spark thrown into dry grass, the way she'd half feared igniting people into a rage that would consume them. It had been something quieter and stronger. It had been a permission. The whole station had been standing at the edge of the same grief she stood in, and had been waiting, without knowing it, for someone to say that it was allowed to matter, that you could be small and far away and still refuse. Devanter waited until the last voice had spoken. Then she turned back to Kael, and for the first time that night something that was almost warmth moved across the old woman's weathered face. "All right, kid," she said. "You've got your witnesses. Now you'd better be right about how to do this, because you've just talked 42 people into putting their bodies between the Emperor and his silence, and I intend to hold you personally responsible for every single one of them." "Understood," Kael said. "Do you?" Devanter's voice sharpened. "Because I need you to understand it all the way down, not just as a feeling. You had the word. Fine. The word was true. But a word is the cheapest part of this. Between here and the moment the galaxy hears the Emperor confess in his own voice, there is a great deal of very hard, very unforgiving work, and any one piece of it going wrong gets people killed. So the romance ends now. From this minute, this isn't about what's in your heart. It's about ranges and windows and encryption and how long we have before someone notices us. Can you do that? Can you turn the word into the work?" And Kael Aurelia, 24 years old, who had come to the edge of everything because she believed that listening was a form of service, looked at the woman who had just handed her the weight of 42 lives, and understood that this was the real test, not the word. Anyone with a working heart could have said the word. The word had been the easy part. The hard part, the part that would decide whether the word meant anything at all, was everything that came after. "Yes," she said, "I can." She turned to her console and she began. The first thing she did was the least dramatic and the most important. She stopped grieving with the front of her mind and started thinking with all of it, and she pulled up the full traffic map of the region. Everything Meridian Watch had passively logged over 11 months. Every channel, every relay, every predictable pattern in the movement of the Concordat's information. She had been swimming in this data for the better part of a year without knowing what it was for. Now she knew. The Concordat, like all old and confident powers, was careless in the way that only the unchallenged can be. It encrypted its military traffic, yes, but it encrypted it against enemies it could imagine, rival great powers, internal rebels, the handful of peer civilizations whose codebreakers it respected. It did not encrypt against humans, because in the mind of the Concordat, humans were not a category of threat. They were not a category of anything. Which meant the encryption, while real, had been designed with a certain contempt for the audience. And contempt, Kael knew, was the mother of every intelligence failure in recorded history. More important than the encryption was the shape of the traffic. The Emperor had done what he did on Senat, and then, exactly as she'd predicted, his fleet had begun to talk about it, because a fleet is a bureaucracy with weapons, and a bureaucracy cannot commit an atrocity without generating paperwork. After-action reports, confirmation of target destruction, propaganda packages meant to be distributed to the subject worlds as a warning. All of it moving through the Concordat's relay network on predictable schedules, in predictable formats, from predictable nodes. Kael found the node she wanted within the hour. It was a relay station the Concordat maintained at the edge of the Senat system itself, the very node through which the Emperor's flagship would have transmitted its reports back toward the Imperial core. Everything the throne knew about what it had done to Senate had passed, or would pass, through that single point. And that single point was within reception range of Meridian Watch's largest array, not comfortably, not easily, but within range. She sat back from the console. Her hands were shaking slightly, and she noticed it the way you notice weather. "I found it," she said quietly, to no one and to everyone. "I found where he keeps his confession." The work that followed did not look like heroism. It looked like a small group of tired people doing difficult technical labor under a deadline they could not see the edges of, and that, Kael came to understand, was what heroism mostly was when you got close enough to watch it happen. The stories cut all of this out. The stories went straight from the word to the reckoning. But the reckoning lived or died in the days between, in the unglamorous grind of turning a listening post into an instrument that could reach across the dark and take an emperor's confession out of his own hands. They had 3 problems, and Kael named them plainly to the crew so that no one could pretend the work was smaller than it was. The first was reception. The Concordat relay at the edge of Senat was at the far limit of what Meridian Watch's arrays could pull in, which meant they would be gathering the Emperor's traffic through a haze of noise, catching fragments, losing pieces, reconstructing more than they received. To make the confession undeniable, to make it something no imperial spokesman could wave away as a human forgery, they needed it clean, complete, and cryptographically authenticated with the Concordat's own signatures intact. A garbled fragment would be worse than nothing. A garbled fragment would be called a lie, and the lie would let the silence back in. The second problem was time. The propaganda packages, the Emperor's boastful account of Senat, dressed up as a warning to the subject worlds, would move through the relay on a schedule, and once they had been distributed, the relay's role would be finished and the traffic would thin to nothing. There was a window. Os, who understood the rhythms of infrastructure better than anyone, estimated it at 9 days, perhaps 10. After that, the confession would still exist somewhere in the Imperial core, buried and guarded, but the open, reachable, careless version of it, the version passing through a lightly defended edge relay because no one imagined anyone was listening, would be gone. The third problem was the one nobody wanted to name, so Devanter named it herself. "The moment we start actively pulling that relay's traffic," she said, "we are no longer passive. Passive listening leaks nothing. But to authenticate what we receive, to confirm we have the real signatures and not corrupted noise, at some point we have to reach toward that relay a handshake, a query, something. And the instant we do that, we exist. We go from being a dead spot on their map to being an anomaly. And empires investigate anomalies. Not quickly, they're arrogant and slow, but they do it. So we get one reach. One. We plan it so carefully that a single active transmission from us gets us everything we need, because the second one might be the one that brings the fleet." Kael took all 3 problems and did not flinch from any of them, and the crew watched her not flinch, and it steadied them. She was young, and she knew they were watching her youth, watching to see whether the words she'd spoken had been the impulse of a girl or the judgment of someone they could follow into real danger. So she made herself into someone they could follow. She stopped sleeping much. She ate at her console. She built over the next several days, with Ridley and Osai and a quiet analyst named Tarn, who turned out to have a genius for signal reconstruction, a plan that addressed all 3 problems at once. They would spend the window listening, purely passively, gathering everything the relay leaked, letting Tarn's reconstruction algorithms rebuild the fragments into something coherent. They would not reach toward the relay at all until they had assembled, from passive fragments alone, as complete a version of the Emperor's confession as they could. And then, at the very last moment before the window closed, they would make their single active reach, one precisely aimed query designed to pull down the cryptographic authentication that would turn their reconstructed confession from a plausible human claim into an undeniable Concordat record. One reach, one handshake, and then silence and flight and the broadcast. It was elegant. It was also, Kael knew, terrifyingly fragile, because it depended on the passive gathering being good enough that the single active reach only had to fetch the signatures, not the substance. If they went into that one reach still needing content, they would have to linger, and lingering was death. So the passive gathering had to be nearly perfect, and that was where the days went. Kael learned things about the Emperor in those days that she would carry for the rest of her life. Not from the atrocity itself. She never once listened to the raw record of what had happened in the gardens of Senat, and she forbade anyone on the crew from doing so, not out of squeamishness, but out of a conviction that had hardened in her since the first night. That to make the horror into a thing you played and replayed was to do a version of what the Emperor wanted, to let the violence become the center. The violence was not the center. The reckoning was the center. So they gathered the record and sealed it and did not open it, and they built their case out of everything around it, the orders, the confirmations, the boasts. And the boasts were the thing. Because Varsk Olith, it turned out, was proud. That was the discovery that changed how Kael understood the whole endeavor. She had imagined, at first, that the Emperor's confession would be buried in the dry language of military reporting, target designations and destruction confirmations, the bureaucratic euphemisms that powerful men used to keep their own crimes at arm's length. Some of it was. But threaded all through it, in the personal command channels, in the messages the Emperor had sent to his own generals and his own subject governors, was something else: pride. He was proud of Senat. He had done a monstrous thing, and he wanted his people to know he had done it, and to understand that he had done it deliberately, as policy, as a demonstration of what the throne was willing to be. He was not hiding. He was not ashamed. In his own transmissions, in his own voice, he explained to his subordinates exactly why the children of Senat had been chosen as the target. Because their deaths would teach a lesson that the deaths of soldiers never could. Because a world will risk its warriors but not its future. Because terror aimed at the future breaks a people in a way that terror aimed at the present cannot. He said this in his own voice, as policy, as pride. And Kael understood, listening to Tarn reconstruct those words fragment by fragment, that the Emperor had made her case for her. She did not need to editorialize. She did not need to add a single word of human outrage. All she needed to do was let the galaxy hear him explain himself. The great powers had spent 8,000 years learning to look away from things like this precisely because things like this were usually hidden, deniable, cloaked in euphemism, easy to not quite know. But Varsk Olith had not hidden it. He had been so certain of his own impunity, so contemptuous of the possibility of consequence, that he had confessed with pride. And pride, unlike a hidden crime, could not be waved away. You cannot claim a fabrication when the man himself is boasting. He thinks no one who matters is listening, Tarn said one night, his voice hollow with a kind of appalled wonder as another fragment resolved. That's the whole of it. Every word of this is him talking to people he owns, in a house he thinks is soundproof. He's not confessing to us. He doesn't know we exist. He's bragging to his own family about the thing he did, and he'd die before he'd let an equal hear it, but he thinks there are no equals in range. He thinks the only ears out here are ears that fear him. There's one set that doesn't, Kael said. The days ground on. The window narrowed. On the 6th day they had a reconstruction that was 80% complete and rising. On the 7th, Osai found a flaw in her own timing estimate, and the window contracted by a full day, and there was a bad hour where it seemed the whole plan might collapse, before Tarn found a way to accelerate the reconstruction by trading some redundancy for speed. On the 8th day, the crew were gray-faced and short-tempered, and running on stimulants, and something harder than stimulants, and Kael had to send 2 of them, over their objections, to sleep, because she could see them making the small errors that precede the large ones. And through all of it, at the edge of every hour was the fleet. Because Devanter had been right about arrogance being slow, but slow was not the same as absent. On the 8th day, the station's passive sensors, the same ears they were using to steal the Emperor's confession, caught something else. A movement. A Concordat patrol element, not large, 3 ships adjusting its course. Not toward Meridian Watch. Not yet. But sweeping, in the wide, unhurried way of a power that does not expect to find anything, through the general region. A routine reassertion of presence in the aftermath of Senat, the Empire flexing to make sure its terror had landed. The patrol was not looking for them, but its course, extended, would bring it close enough that a single careless active transmission from the station might register on its sensors as exactly the anomaly Devanter had feared. The math was suddenly very tight. The single active reach they needed to make, the one handshake to pull the authentication signatures, had to happen inside the window before the propaganda distribution ended, but now it also had to happen either well before that patrol came into detection range, or in a specific brief shadow when the patrol's own sensor sweep would be turned the wrong way. OS ran the numbers 3 times. The 2 constraints left them a gap of about 40 minutes, roughly 31 hours from now, in which the reach could be made with acceptable risk. 40 minutes. After 8 days of work, the entire endeavor came down to a 40-minute window a day and a bit away, into which they would have to fit one perfect active transmission, gather the signatures that would make the confession undeniable, and then go dark and run. Kael gathered the crew in the signals bay one last time before the window. She had not planned a speech and she did not give one. She was too tired for eloquence and she had come to distrust it anyway. She just laid out the plan, plainly, the way Devanter had taught her to lay things out, all ranges and windows and contingencies. And then, at the end, she said the only thing that was not technical. "I said a word 8 days ago," she said. "Some of you have probably wondered since then whether it was worth what it's cost. The sleep, the fear. Os hasn't called her kids because we've gone silent to stay hidden, and she's got 2 of them wondering why their mother stopped answering. Every one of you has paid something." She looked around the room. "I don't have a way to make that worth it. There isn't one. Senat's children are still dead and nothing we do brings them back, and I'm not going to stand here and pretend our being tired is a noble thing next to what happened to them. It isn't, but here's what I know. In 31 hours we're going to reach out one time, and if it works, the Emperor of 8,000 years is going to lose the one thing he murdered a world to buy. Not his throne, not his fleet, his silence, and I have come to believe that the silence was the real weapon. The killing was just how he loaded it. So when we take the silence away from him, we're not undoing Senat. We're making sure Senat wasn't the start of what he wanted it to be the start of. And that, the difference between a world dying into silence and a world dying into a reckoning, that's the whole of what one witness can do. It's not nothing. I used to think it was everything, and I was wrong about that. It's not everything, but it's not nothing. It's the exact size of the thing that was asked of us, and we can do it." Nobody cheered. It was not that kind of room, and it was not that kind of moment. But she saw the thing she needed to see in their faces, the settled, grim, unromantic resolve of people who had decided, and she knew they would hold. They took their positions, and they waited for the window. In the hours of waiting, Kael found herself thinking about the sender of the first signal, and she came to understand that she had been thinking about them almost continuously since the night the message arrived, in the way one thinks about a person one has met only once and will never meet again, but whose face has somehow lodged permanently behind one's eyes. She did not know who they had been. The signal carried no name, no identity, nothing but the plea and the number, and at the very end the stopping. But she had built a person around the absence, the way the grieving always do, a Thren, an adult, someone who had survived the atrocity in the gardens by some accident of geography or timing, someone who had understood in the moments after that there would be no rescue and no revenge and no undoing, and who had nonetheless dragged themselves to a transmitter and spent the last coherent energy of their life not on a curse and not on a scream but on a request. Please let someone know. It was such a small thing to ask, and such an enormous one. It presumed, against all the evidence of the burning world around them, that the universe still contained a someone capable of caring that this had happened. It was an act of faith aimed into a dark that had just proven itself faithless. And the faith had not been misplaced. That was the thing that undid Kael when she let herself feel it, which she tried not to do, because feeling it made her hands shake and her hands could not shake. The faith had not been misplaced. Someone had heard. Someone did care. The universe had, against the terrible weight of the evidence, contained a someone after all, a 24-year-old on a nothing station, who happened to have been listening, who happened to still believe that listening was a form of service. She thought about how narrow it had been. If the shift schedule had been different, someone else would have caught the signal, someone who might have done the sensible thing, the survivable thing, filed the report and gone to sleep. If she had been anywhere else in her life, anyone else, older or harder or more accustomed to the way the galaxy filed its horrors, she might have looked away. The whole reckoning, she saw, had balanced on the point of a single accident of attention. The sender had thrown their faith into the dark, and it had been pure chance that it landed in the one pair of hands on the frontier that would not let it fall, except that Kael did not quite believe in the chance. She was not a religious person, but she had come to feel, in the days since the signal, that there was something in the shape of it that was more than luck, that a plea aimed with that much need into the dark had a kind of gravity to it, that it did not land randomly but sought, and found, the ear that could bear its weight. She knew this was not a defensible thing to believe. She believed it anyway. It was the only way she could carry it. "You've gone somewhere," Tarn said. He had come to sit beside her at some point in the small hours, the way people did now, the crew orbiting Kael in their fear the way they had once orbited Devanter, and she had noticed it and had made her peace with it, because she understood that they needed a center and she happened to be it, and refusing the role would have been a vanity dressed up as humility. "Where'd you go?" "To the person who sent it," Kael said. "I keep going back to them. I never even heard their voice. It was all machine translation, flat, no person in it. But I feel like I owe them something more specific than what we're doing. Like the broadcast is the right thing, but it's also somehow general. It answers the atrocity. It doesn't answer the person." Tarn was quiet for a while. He was a strange, quiet man, all angles and long silences, and Kael had worked beside him for months without ever quite knowing him, and now, in the compression of the last days, she had come to feel that she knew him better than people she had spent years with, because catastrophe does that. It burns off the small talk and leaves only the load-bearing parts of a person exposed. "When I was reconstructing his transmissions," Tarn said slowly, "the Emperor's, there was a lot of noise, and the algorithms fill gaps by pattern matching against everything else in the stream. And in one of the fragments buried under the after-action reporting there was a piece of something else, not from the Emperor, from the Senate side. A local transmission from before that the Concordat relay had incidentally logged and that got tangled into the traffic we were pulling." He paused. "It was a lullaby, Kael, a creche transmission, someone singing to the children in one of the gardens, broadcast over the local network the way you'd play music through a house. From before. I almost sent it to you and then I didn't, because I thought it would break you and I needed you unbroken. I sealed it with the atrocity record and I never opened it again. But I want you to know it exists, because you keep saying we're answering the atrocity and not the person, and I think you're wrong. I think the person we're answering isn't the one who sent the plea. I think it's the ones who were being sung to. And I think the way you answer a lullaby that got interrupted is exactly what we're doing. You make sure the interruption isn't the end of the story. You make sure it doesn't get to be the last thing. That's the whole of what a witness is for. Not to answer the killing. To refuse to let the killing be the last word over the singing." Kael did not say anything for a long time. She could not. And Tarn did not need her to, and that was its own kind of mercy, and the two of them sat together in the cold blue light and watched the patrol's track crawl across the display and did not speak. And it was, in a strange way, the closest thing to peace that either of them would feel in the whole terrible span of it. When she could speak again, she said only, "Thank you for not sending it to me, and thank you for telling me it's there." "When it's over," Tarn said. "If it's over and we're still here, which we won't be, but if, I think the last block of the broadcast should be the lullaby, not the atrocity record. Him confessing, all of it, the pride, the policy, and then at the very end, under his own signature, unkillable, propagating out into every ear in his empire forever, the thing he tried to silence, the singing, so that the last thing anyone in his whole empire ever hears attached to his name is the sound of the thing he thought he could kill, going on." Kael turned to look at him. "That's not evidence," she said quietly. "It doesn't authenticate anything. Strategically, it's dead weight." "I know," Tarn said. "Do it anyway," Kael said. "Put it last. That's an order if you need it to be one. Put the singing last." And so, in the plan that had been built entirely out of ranges and windows and encryption, and the cold arithmetic of survival, there came to be one piece that was none of those things, one final block, of no evidentiary value whatsoever, that would go out into the dark after everything else, attached to the Emperor's own signature, carrying the sound of an interrupted lullaby out across an empire that had tried to end it. It was the least strategic decision in the whole endeavor. It was also, Kael would think in her last minutes, the truest one, the one that most exactly answered the plea, because the sender had not asked to be avenged and had not asked to be rescued. They had asked, "Please, let it not be as though it never was." And a lullaby sent out unkillable across the sky forever was the most complete way of saying, it was real. It happened. The singing happened and the children happened, and no amount of silence you tried to buy will make it as though they never were. We heard. We heard all of it, the plea and the killing and the singing underneath, and we will not let the sky forget the singing. She slept in the end, for perhaps 2 hours. Devanter's prediction about her not sleeping proved wrong, because the body takes what it needs when the mind finally sets down its heaviest stone, and Kael had set hers down when Tarn told her about the lullaby, and she decided what to do with it. She slept without dreams, or without dreams she could remember, and she woke clear-headed and calm in a way she had not been since the signal came, and she washed her face and drank the water Devanter had told her to drink and went to her station to wait for the window, and she was ready. Not resigned. Ready. There is a difference, and she had found it, somewhere in the space between an emperor's pride and a stranger's lullaby, in the hours of waiting that the stories would leave out. The 31 hours before the window were the longest of Kael's life, and they were made of nothing. That was the particular torment of it. There was no more work to do that mattered. The reconstruction was as complete as it would ever get, sitting at 94%. A version of the Emperor's confession so nearly whole that only the cryptographic signatures, the thing the single active reach would fetch, stood between it and undeniability. Everything else was ready. And so the crew had nothing to do but wait, and check things that did not need checking, and watch the slow arithmetic of the approaching patrol tick down toward the 40-minute gap. Kael did not sleep. She sat in the signals bay through the small hours, and at some point Devanter came and sat with her, and the two women watched the patrol's track crawl across the tactical display in silence for a while. "You know what the histories are going to say about you," Devanter said eventually. It was not a question. "They're not going to say anything about me," Kael said. "I'm a signals officer on a station nobody's heard of." Devanter made a low sound that might have been a laugh. "That's what everyone who ends up in the histories thinks, right up until the moment they don't. No, listen to me, because I've been at this a long time and I've watched a few hinges turn, and I know one when I'm sitting next to it." She turned in her seat to face Kael directly. "You think the important thing you did was the plan. The relay, the window, the reconstruction. Clever work, all of it, and it might even succeed. But that's not the thing. If you hadn't said the word, none of the rest would exist. 42 people would have filed a report and gone back to sleep and hated themselves quietly for the rest of their lives, and Senate would have died into exactly the silence he built it to die into. You didn't just find the confession, kid. You made a room full of frightened, sensible, self-preserving people believe that their refusal could matter. That's the rarest thing there is. Fleets are common. Code breakers are common. A person who can stand in a room and make ordinary people believe that they, personally, are allowed to refuse the thing everyone else has agreed to accept. That's the thing empires can't manufacture and can't buy and can't ever quite kill, though God knows they try. Kael was quiet for a moment. I didn't feel like I was doing anything rare, she said. I just couldn't say the other words. Report. Wait. They wouldn't come out. It wasn't courage. It was more like I physically couldn't be the person who said them. That is what courage is, Devanter said. Everyone imagines it's a feeling, a great swell of bravery that carries you over the top. It isn't. It's the specific inability to become the person the safe choice would require you to be. You couldn't say wait because saying wait would have made you into someone you couldn't live as. That's the whole of it. That's every brave thing anyone has ever done. She stood and put a hand briefly on Kael's shoulder the first time she had ever touched her. Get some water. Not sleep, you won't sleep, but water. In 19 hours, you're going to need to be the steadiest person in this station, because when the window opens, everyone is going to look at you, and if your hand is shaking, they'll see it and it'll spread. So, water. And then sit here with me and watch the sky, and let's neither of us pretend we're calm. The window opened at the hour I had calculated, and it opened into chaos, because the universe does not respect plans. The patrol's course had held true almost to the last, and the 40-minute gap had held, and for the first 11 minutes everything went exactly as designed. Kael made the active reach, one clean, tight, precisely aimed transmission toward the Concordat relay at the edge of Senat, a query shape to look, to any casual Imperial monitor, like a routine relay network handshake, but carrying underneath it the request that would pull down the authentication signatures. She sent it, and the transmission crossed the dark, and they waited the long, agonizing minutes for the round trip, every second of which was a second in which they existed on the Concordat's map, a bright anomalous point where there should have been nothing. The signatures came back. Tarn confirmed it in a voice gone thin with disbelief and relief. The authentication was intact. The Concordat's own cryptographic signatures, wrapped around the Emperor's own words, verifiable by anyone in the galaxy who held the Concordat's public keys, which was to say, verifiable by every power that had ever done business with the throne, which was to say, everyone. The confession was no longer a human claim. It was a Concordat document, signed by the Concordat's own hand, and it said, in the Emperor's own proud voice, exactly what he had done and exactly why. They had it, 94% of the substance and 100% of the authentication. It was enough. It was more than enough. Package it, Kael said. Package it and get ready to broadcast. Wide, everything. Every channel we can reach, every relay, the whole region, and then the long transmission home to Fleet Command with our authentication on top of theirs. Go. And that was when the patrol turned. It should not have. By every calculation, the patrol's sensor sweep should have been facing away during the window, and the single active reach should have registered, if at all, as a fading ghost the patrol's systems would dismiss. But the universe does not respect plans, and one of the three ships, later, Kael would learn it had been a green sensor officer running an unscheduled diagnostic sweep, a piece of pure bad luck, an eager young alien doing exactly the kind of extra, unrequired diligence that Kael herself would have praised in one of her own crew. One of the three ships caught the reach. Not clearly, not enough to understand it, but enough to flag an anomaly where the charts said there should be nothing, and enough for the patrol commander, in the reflexive caution of an empire reasserting its terror, to alter course to investigate. Toward Meridian Watch. The tactical display told the story in cold geometry. The patrol was not fast, nothing about the Concordat was fast, but it was closing, And the math that Osei ran, gray-faced, in the 90 seconds after the course change, was brutally simple. The broadcast Kael wanted the wide, complete, region-filling transmission that would put the Emperor's confession into every ear in reach and make the silence truly impossible, would take time. A large amount of data, sent widely and redundantly to defeat jamming and ensure survival, on old arrays that were never built for this. 40 minutes minimum to send it in the robust, unkillable way that would guarantee it propagated beyond any hope of suppression. The patrol would be in weapons range of the station in 26. The signal's bay went very quiet. Kael understood the shape of the choice immediately, because it was the shape of every choice that had ever mattered, stripped down to its bones. They could send fast and thin, a compressed, minimal, fragile transmission that might get out in the time they had, but which would be vulnerable, jammable, easy for the Concordat to suppress or corrupt or drown, a transmission that might reach a few ears and then be smothered. Or they could send it the right way, the robust way, the way that would make the confession truly unkillable and truly universal. And to do that, they would have to stay and transmit through the arrival of the patrol, and keep transmitting after the patrol arrived, which meant keep transmitting while the patrol did to Meridian watch what an armed warship does to an unarmed listening post. There was no version where they sent it robustly and survived. That was the plain arithmetic of it. The robust broadcast required more time than they had before the guns arrived, which meant the only way to complete it was to keep the arrays firing after the guns opened up, which meant someone had to keep the station transmitting while the station was being killed. Devanter was already moving. "Everyone who isn't essential to the broadcast to the cutter," she said, in the flat, clear command voice of someone who had known this moment might come and had made her peace with it hours ago. "Now, Osei, get the reactor to give the arrays everything. We're not saving it for later. There is no later for this station. Ridley, evacuation. You have 4 minutes to load the cutter and undock. Move." "Commander," Kael started. "The cutter can take most of you," Devanter said over her to the room. "It can't take all of you, and it can't take the arrays, and the arrays are the whole point. So here's how it goes. The cutter launches with everyone it can hold, and it runs, and it carries a copy of everything, insurance, in case the broadcast fails. And a skeleton crew stays and runs the arrays and sends the confession the right way, the unkillable way, all the way to the end. That's the split. That's the only split that saves both the people and the point." Her eyes found Kael's. "And before you say it, no, you're on the cutter. You said the word, you built the plan, you are the witness, and the witness has to survive to testify if the broadcast fails. That's not sentiment, it's redundancy. You go." "No," Kael said. It came out of her the same way the word witness had come out of her, 8 days before, not from a decision but from beneath one, from the same place that had refused to let her say report and wait. She heard herself say it and knew it was true before she understood why. "The witness stays with the witnessing," she said. "That's the whole meaning of the word. You don't testify from a lifeboat, Commander. You testify from where the thing happens. If I run and someone else's hands send the confession while the station dies around them, then I didn't witness anything, I delegated it and fled. And everything I said in that room 8 days ago was a lie I talked 42 people into believing." She was already at the master array control, already locking herself into the sequence. "The cutter carries the copy. That's the redundancy. That's real and it's smart, and it means this survives even if we don't. But the person who sends the true broadcast, the unkillable one from the station to the end, that's me. It was always going to have to be me. I just didn't know it until now." Devanter looked at her for one long second, and in that second an argument was had and lost without a word of it spoken aloud, because Devanter was old enough and wise enough to recognize the same immovable thing in Kael that Kael had recognized in herself, and to know that fighting it would only waste time they did not have. "Then I stay too," Devanter said. "The station is mine and I don't leave it. Don't argue, I'm 60, I've had my life, and someone with command authority has to be here to hold it together when it gets bad. Os, you have children, you go. That's an order and it's the last one I'll give you, so obey it. Osai's face twisted, and for a moment it looked as if she would refuse, and then she thought of two faces in the inner systems and she nodded once, and it was the hardest nod Kael had ever seen anyone make. Ridley, you run the cutter. You're the best pilot we've got and those people need the best. Tarn. I'm staying, Tarn said. You need someone on reconstruction to feed the arrays clean or half of it goes out as noise. That's me. Nobody else can do it fast enough. He was already sitting back down at his station, and his hands were not quite steady, and he sat on them for a moment to still them and then put them back on the controls. I found his voice in the noise. I'm going to be the one who sends it. Yeah. That's mine. 3 of them then. Kael, Devanter, Tarn, and the cutter for everyone else. The next 4 minutes were the loud kind, the kind that in memory becomes a single blurred motion. The crew loading the cutter, the shouted checklists, the copy of everything they had gathered loaded aboard as insurance. Osai pausing at the hatch to grip Kael's shoulder hard enough to bruise and say nothing because there was nothing to say. Ridley's voice over the comm running the undock sequence. The hard thud through the hull as the cutter released, and its engines lit, and it ran, small and bright and dwindling. Out into the dark and away. And then the station was quiet, and there were 3 of them, and the patrol was 19 minutes out, and the broadcast needed 40. It doesn't add up, Tarn said quietly, saying the thing they were all thinking. 19 minutes to weapons range, 40 to send it robust. We start the broadcast and we're 8 minutes past our own deaths before it finishes. We stay to the end, they'll have stopped us at minute 19. Then we make them not stop us at minute 19, Kael said. Her mind was moving very fast and very clearly now, the fear pushed down into a place where it could not reach her hands. They don't know what we're doing. They caught an anomaly and they came to investigate. They think they're coming to check on a ghost. When they arrive and find a human station transmitting, their first instinct won't be to destroy it, it'll be to demand we stop, to hail us, to assert authority because that's what an empire does, it commands before it kills. Arrogance is slow, Commander said it herself. So we use the slowness. We don't stop. We don't answer their hails. We make them spend their arrogance. Every minute they waste demanding our surrender instead of firing is a minute of broadcast we didn't think we had. And when they run out of patience, Tarn said. Then it's done or it isn't, Kael said. Send it in priority order. The authentication first, the signatures, the proof it's real. That's the small, unkillable core that goes out in the first 90 seconds, and after that it doesn't matter what they do, the galaxy can verify it's genuine. Then the confession itself, his voice, the pride, all of it, biggest and most complete blocks first. We build it so that every minute they let us keep sending, more of the truth is already beyond recall. So that stopping us stops mattering more with every second. So that by the time they finally decide to kill us, the killing is pointless because the thing is already loose. Tarn stared at her, and then something that was almost a smile crossed his exhausted face. You're structuring the broadcast so that every moment of it is already a victory. So there's no single point where they can win by stopping us. There's no such thing as too late if you build it right, Kael said. That's the trap he set for Senat, that it would be too late for anyone to matter. So we build a thing where it's never too late, where every second already counts, where there's no clean moment for the door to close. Send it. Tarn sent it. The authentication signatures went out first, in the first 90 seconds, wide and redundant across every channel the arrays could reach. The small, verifiable, unkillable core of proof. And the instant that core was gone, beyond recall, propagating outward across the region at the speed of light toward every listening ear in the Concordat and beyond, Kael felt the fear leave her entirely, because the thing Devanter had named as the hinge had already turned. Whatever happened to the 3 of them now, the confession was real and it was loose, and it could not be called back. The rest was just how much of the truth they could push out into the dark before the guns arrived. The patrol arrived at minute 19, exactly as predicted, and it did exactly what Kael had predicted, which was the only reason any of it worked. It hailed, it demanded. 3 Concordat warships, vast and old and confident, filling the station's screens, transmitting the Imperial Authority Assertion Protocol that had counted 1,000 worlds for 8,000 years. Cease all transmission, identify, submit to inspection, by order of the Ascendant Throne. And the 3 humans in the dying station did not cease, did not identify, did not answer at all, and simply kept sending, block after block of the Emperor's own confession pouring out into the sky, and the patrol commander, faced with the utterly unprecedented experience of a nothing station full of irrelevant humans simply ignoring the voice of the throne, did exactly what arrogance does. He spent time. He hailed again. He escalated the demand. He consulted his superiors, because an officer of an 8,000-year empire does not fire on an anomaly without confirmation, and the confirmation took time, and every second of that time was another block of truth gone irretrievably into the dark. They got 34 minutes, not 40. But 34, which was 15 more than the arithmetic had promised. 15 minutes bought entirely with the Emperor's own arrogance. And in 34 minutes the broadcast completed everything that mattered: the full authentication, the whole of the reconstructed confession, the Emperor's proud voice explaining to his own generals why he had chosen the children of Senat as his lesson. All of it out, all of it loose, all of it beyond any power in the galaxy to call back. And then, in the last 30 seconds, after the evidence and the confession and the signatures, Tarn sent the final block, the one of no evidentiary value, the one Kael had ordered him to put last. The interrupted lullaby, the crushed transmission from before, the sound of someone singing to the children of Senat's gardens over a house-wide network on an ordinary evening that had turned out to be the last one. It went out into the dark under the Emperor's own signature, attached forever to his own confession, propagating outward at the speed of light across the whole of the empire. He had murdered a world to silence, the exact sound he had tried to end, going on, unkillable, saying without a single word of argument the only thing that needed saying. It was real. It happened. The singing happened, and no silence you can buy will ever make it as though it never was. Tarn confirmed completion at minute 34, and his voice cracked as he said it, and Devanter closed her eyes. The patrol received its confirmation to fire at minute 36. Kael Aurelia was at the master array when it happened, and she was not afraid, and that surprised her. And in the last clear moments she found she was thinking not of herself and not even of the Emperor, but of the sender of the first signal, the one who had stood in the ruin of their whole world and used the last of their strength to ask, "Please, let someone know, let it not be as though it never was." She had answered them. That was the thought she held. Across 41 hours and an impossible gulf of dark, someone had asked to be witnessed, and she had heard them, and she had witnessed them, all the way to the end, from where the thing happened, the way witnessing has to be done. The silence the Emperor had killed a world to buy was already gone, spreading outward at the speed of light, unkillable, and there was nothing left that his guns could take from her that mattered more than what she had already given away. "It's out," she said to Devanter, to Tarn, to the sender of the signal, to the children of the gardens, to the dark. "It's out and it can't be stopped. We did the thing that was asked." Then the guns spoke and Meridian Watch went silent, but only the station, not the signal. The signal went on. The reckoning that followed did not look like the reckonings of the old galaxy, and that was Kael's doing too, though she did not live to see it. The old galaxy's reckonings were fleets and fire. Atrocity answered with atrocity, the strong breaking the strong until something else was left standing on the rubble. This was not that. The confession, once loose, could not be unheard, and it had come with its own authentication, signed by the Concordat's own hand, so that no imperial spokesman could call it a human lie. The subject worlds of the throne heard their emperor explain in his own proud voice, exactly why he had murdered the children of Senat, and the terror he had meant to instill curdled, in ear after ear, world after world, into something he had not planned for and could not fight, because it did not come at him as a fleet. It came at him as a refusal. The very silence he had killed to buy became impossible, and without the silence, the terror did not compound into obedience. It compounded into contempt, and then into defiance, and the subject governors who had feared him began, quietly and then not quietly, to find that they no longer did. He did not fall in a battle. He fell the way the truly powerful always fall when the silence around them breaks, from within, abandoned, as the machinery of an empire that runs on fear discovers that its fear has been spent and cannot be recovered. It took time. It was not clean and it was not total, and the galaxy was not remade into something perfect. But Varsk Olith, who had murdered a world to make an example, became one, a warning not to the subjects he had meant to terrify, but to every powerful thing in the sky that had ever assumed the small and the far away were not listening. And the humans. The galaxy learned the humans after that. Not as a fleet, they still had no fleet worth the name. It learned them as the species that had heard a dying world's plea across 41 hours of dead space, and had not been able to look away, that had not yet grown the callous, that had answered an atrocity not with matching slaughter but with an unkillable insistence on the truth. It learned that there was a people, young and raw and small, in whom the ancient reflex of turning away had not yet set, and that this made them dangerous in a way that no amount of firepower could measure, because a power that will not be silent is a power that fear cannot govern, and fear was the only currency the old galaxy truly understood. They named her in the end. The histories that Kael had insisted would never mention her carved her name into the founding of a different kind of order, and the word she had spoken in the cold blue light of the signal's bay became the word that 100 later refusals invoked when they too decided not to look away. But she would have cared less about the name than about the thing the name stood for, which was simple, and which she had understood completely in the last 34 minutes of her life, sending the truth out into the dark while the guns closed in. An emperor had slaughtered thousands of children to purchase a silence, and a young human, hearing of it across an impossible distance, with no fleet and no power and no hope of rescuing anyone, had refused to let the silence be bought. She had said one word, and the word had been witness, and she had meant by it not a filing but a life her own, spent to the last second making sure that what he had done could never be unheard. That was the whole of it. That was the reckoning. Not fire answering fire, but a witness who would not be silenced, buying the truth its freedom with everything she had. Please, the signal had said, let it not be as though it never was. It was not as though it never was. She had seen to that, and because she had, neither was she.